This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is August 16th, 2020. I'm producer Pat, and with me is Cristina Roach.
Hey, everybody.
Darren and Adam continue to record from isolation, but we are starting to look at options to get back to panel shows.
Woohoo!
Hopefully soon. We have two interesting segments for you today. Cristina, you're going to tell us about what happens to plastic bottles that we put in our recycle bins. But before that, we throw things to Darren, who brings us a deep dive into the question, does anonymous hiring work?
Ooh.
About a month ago, there was a recent article arguing that hiring tests for orchestras shouldn't be anonymized, to which many thought, what? Wasn't the anonymous hiring for orchestras the very thing that helped reduce discrimination? It also made me think, I guess it's time to finally do that segment on anonymous hiring that I've had on my list for about a year. I'll discuss what it is and what has been done in various places, while aiming to address the main question, does it work? My links are diverse and available at trcpodcast.com, but I'll especially use a pilot project done by the Canadian government that was exploring whether they should implement anonymous hiring. When they started the pilot project, it was called Name Blind Recruitment Pilot Project, but is now the Anonymized Recruitment Pilot Project. The explanation was that, quote, this name better reflects the methodology used for the pilot, which focused on anonymizing applications by concealing names as well as other significant personal information, and there's no need to invoke blindness when it isn't appropriate. And with that, I've already indicated what it is. Various pieces of personal information are concealed so that sex and/or gender and/or race and/or ethnicity cannot be determined. The objective of the Canadian pilot project is pretty much the same as the objectives for all the places that do this, quoting, to determine whether concealing personal information, which could lead to the identification of a candidate's origin from job applications, had an impact on the screening decisions made by reviewers when compared to the traditional assessment methods where all personal information was presented. Why do this? Because there's been a long history of discrimination towards women and other minorities, and many think it would be better to move towards something meritocratic, based on merit or something like that. More on that later. I'll mainly talk about the symphony orchestras, using them as bookends, but describe other initiatives along the way. So, starting with the symphony orchestra study from 20 years ago. It was written by two economists, Claudia Golden and Celia Rouse, and they wanted to know whether blind, now they use the term blind selection, and I'm going to try to use the word anonymous selection, because I think that's more appropriate, but sometimes I'll quote them and they might say blind. Anonymous selection was responsible for increased numbers of women hired for orchestra positions, meaning it was looking back at data already collected to explain a recent phenomena. In the 1950s, hiring reforms were implemented in orchestras, and some of these reforms were to use anonymous hiring. Quote, in the years after these changes were instituted, the percent of female musicians in the 5 highest-ranked orchestras in the nation increased from 6% in 1970 to 21% in 1993. So their study looked at audition records, quote, from 8 major symphony orchestras dating from the late 1950s to 1995. The analysis sample for auditions consists of about 14,000 person rounds, 7,000 individuals, and 580 audition rounds. They concluded that, quote, the transition to blind auditions from 1970 to the 1990s can explain 30% of the increase in the proportion female among new hires, and possibly 25% of the increase in percentage female in the orchestras. So percents of percents can be tricky, but if we use the numbers which they sort of cited, which went from 6% in 1970 to 21% in the early 90s, that's an increase of 15 percentage points, and anonymous hiring might be responsible for 5 percentage points if it's 30% responsible, which would be significant. But did this finding hold up? Well, yeah, mostly, but it is more nuanced. A 2019 piece in Bloomberg by Faye Flam, who is pushing back on the replication crisis being applied to these orchestras, says that the results were complicated and it often depended on the different rounds of selection to show an effect, as there were 3 different rounds. Quoting her piece, in an interview, Golden said that they were particularly interested in seeing what happened to the subset of people who applied to both blind and non-blind auditions. Asking people to audition behind a screen might bring in a different, more diverse group of applicants, she said, but there were some musicians who applied to both kinds. Comparing how they performed in blind versus non-blind auditions would offer a kind of natural experiment, and that's where those controversial numbers surface. End quote. Flam then quotes the paper saying, quote, "Using the audition data, we find that the screen increases by 50% the probability that a woman will be advanced from certain preliminary rounds and increases by several-fold the likelihood that a woman will be selected in the final round." That is the finding that made headlines and TED Talks and whatnot. This so-called anonymous hiring, blind screening, 50% increase. Now, Flam usefully cites stats challenger Andrew Gelman, who said he couldn't figure out how they got that 50% number, so he couldn't verify it. Bit of context, Gelman's been absolutely great on the replication crisis and highlighting how many people are doing bad stats, so he's pretty trustworthy. But he couldn't even figure out how they got this number. And now I'll quote Flam in her Bloomberg article. "That's fair criticism. But even if their data," this is the two economists, "were too noisy to determine that blind auditions increased female hires, that doesn't prove that there's no effect, or that discrimination didn't exist." Goldman said that their number comes from isolating just the cases where the same people applied in both kinds of auditions and applies, as the paper says, only to certain stages of the process. Ooh, so I think Flam was trying to offer defense and support here, but I think that makes things worse in my opinion. Even if there's no useful data to support a hypothesis, that doesn't mean it isn't true? Well, no, of course not, but that's not usually how science works. So in a scientific publication, or even as an economist publication, which is sort of a science, we want there to be reliable data, and we definitely want other people to figure out how these numbers were deduced and figured out. So that's a problem. Also, we usually test against no effect, or the null hypothesis and all that. So I don't think that really helps overall in this particular case. As my segment isn't supposed to be about just that one study, I'll say that it seems like there is some usefulness to anonymous selection to increase female hires in orchestras, but is not consistent, may not generalize, and it may not be that large. And now I'll give a bit of a sample of some other studies that have been done, while wishing I had the time and skill to do a thorough meta-analysis. Quoting the Canadian pilot paper, which cites, quote, "An international study of anonymous job applications of new PhD economists, Krauss et al. In 2011, observed that women had a lower probability of being invited to an interview when their identity was concealed during the selection process. Anonymization of candidate information prevented the use of positive measures aimed at improving the representation of women." But in a different paper by Krauss et al. In 2012, looking at data from France, Germany, the Netherlands, and Sweden, it was observed statistically differences between anonymized and traditional methods of screening candidates. Quoting the Canadian pilot page, quote, "They noted, however, that the direction of the difference, beneficial or detrimental, was inconsistent where anonymization showed beneficial effects in some processes and lowered the probability of being invited to an interview in other situations. The authors noted that it is possible that the benefits of anonymization depend on whether discrimination is present in the hiring process. They also noted that anonymization may negatively impact subgroups of candidates by preventing the implementation of existing positive measures aimed at promoting greater diversity." End quote. So those are a couple findings, but it also seems true that various studies show that resumes sent out to employers with quote-unquote foreign names are less likely to get an interview than stereotypical white names, to some degree or another. For example, a 2011 study by Oropoulos found, this is quoting the abstract, "Thousands of randomly manipulated resumes were sent in response to online job postings in Toronto to investigate why immigrants, allowed in based on skill, struggle in the labor market. The study finds substantial discrimination across a variety of occupations towards applicants with foreign experience or those with Indian, Pakistani, Chinese, and Greek names compared with English names. Listing language fluency, multinational firm experience, education from highly selective schools, or active extracurricular activities had no diminishing effect. Recruiters justify this behavior based on language skill concerns, but fail to fully account for offsetting features when listed." So this seems to be clearly discriminatory, but less given the reason provided by recruiters, provided the recruiters are accurately tracking reality and people consistently overestimate their abilities on a resume, which many people do. Is that true for language? Hard to say. Is there some discrimination? Probably. Now, another noteworthy finding was in 2016. The Australian Public Service, the APS, or the APS, wanted to assess whether women and minorities are discriminated against in the early stages of the recruitment process for senior positions. Quote, "Over 2,100 public servants from 15 agencies participated in the trial. They completed an exercise in which they shortlisted applicants for a hypothetical senior role in their agency. Participants were randomly assigned to receive application materials for candidates in standard form or in de-identified form, with information about candidate gender, race, and ethnicity removed." So here, de-identified would be similar to the antiquated blind and now the anonymous word that I'm using. Another quote, "The results showed that overall, de-identifying applications at the shortlisting stage does not appear to assist in promoting diversity within the APS in hiring. Overall, APS officers discriminated in favor of female and minority candidates." End quote. Meaning, When all candidates' information was made available, hiring was biased towards female and minority candidates. So looping back to the Canadian anonymized recruitment pilot project, they released their results in 2018, and I said their objective was at the beginning, but what did they actually do? Well, the methods: 27 external processes launched between April and October 2017 across 17 participating organizations were used. The resulting sample comprised about 2,200 candidates, including about 680 members of visible minorities, which is about 31% of the sample. They had 54 independent reviewers, 2 reviewers per process, participating in the pilot, resulting in about 4,400 independent screening decisions. They had 4 conditions, so both reviewers did the traditional method, both reviewers did an anonymous method, and then each of the reviewers did the traditional and the anonymous, and then they switched, so that makes 4. What did they remove from the applications? Well, they removed the last name, first name, initials, and any other reference to the candidate's name. But they were more thorough than that. They also removed citizenship and country of origin, mailing addresses, telephone number, educational institutions, any reference to organizations, businesses, or establishments where general training or professional experience were required, languages spoken and written, any reference to geographical locations other than those related to a professional association, any reference that may indicate the candidate is a member of an employment equity group other than female gender, because it was focused on minorities, any reference to religion, any reference to publications, university or other. So that's a lot. They did various types of factor analysis to deduce what was actually going on here, and I'll share some of those findings with you now. The main finding was that anonymizing the assessment method significantly reduces the screen-in rate of candidates overall. Okay, so just as an overall measure, they looked at screening rates by assessment method, and using the traditional method, 48.3% were screened in, and in the name-blind recruitment, or the anonymized recruitment, it was 43.3%. That's a difference of 5 percentage points, and this was statistically significantly different. Okay, but the whole point was, what about visible minorities? So across methods, for visible minorities, results indicated no significant effect on the screening decision of applications. So while there were numerical differences, these were not statistically significantly different. Consequently, with the methodology and analyses used, there was no evidence of bias in the Canadian anonymized recruitment pilot project. Now that I've given you a sample of different anonymization studies that have occurred, we're going to turn back to the other bookend, another piece about orchestras. The New York Times ran an opinion piece by Anthony Tomasini with the headline, quote, "To make orchestras more diverse, end blind auditions," end quote, in which he argued that if ensembles are to reflect the communities they serve, the audition process should take into account race, gender, and other factors. He discusses the anonymized auditions of the 1970s, saying it helped increase the number of women from 6 to 30%. Now, we know that isn't quite true based on what I just told you, and it may not have played such a large role, but it probably had some sort of effect. Regardless, though, Tomasini says, quote, "American orchestras remain among the nation's least racially diverse institutions, especially in regard to Black and Latino artists. In a 2014 study, only 1.8% of the players in top ensembles were Black, and just 2.5% were Latino. At the time of the Philharmonic's 1969 discrimination case, it had 1 Black player, the first it ever hired, Sanford Allen, a violinist. Today, in a city that is a quarter Black, just 1 out of 106 full-time players is Black, Anthony McGill, the principal clarinet," end quote. Tomasini goes on to say, here's another quote, "Blind auditions are based on the appealing premise of pure meritocracy. An orchestra should be built from the very best players, period. But ask anyone in the field, and you'll learn that over the past century of increasingly professionalized training, there has come to be remarkably little difference between players at the top tier. A typical orchestra audition might end up attracting dozens of people who are essentially indistinguishable in their musicianship and technique." So if this is indeed the case, and the applicants are essentially indistinguishable, it isn't clear why there are fewer Black and Latino people being hired. We would guess it was discriminatory if auditions weren't anonymized, but that's not the issue. So the natural thought is, well, is this a pipeline problem? The amount of people are actually applying in the first place? Tomasini mentions Afa S. Dworkin, who is, quote, "the president of the Sphinx organization, which is dedicated to encouraging diversity in classical music by fostering young artists, and saying that it isn't a pipeline problem." Now, to be honest, here's where I think Tomasini undercuts his own goal. If it is true that there isn't a pipeline problem, and auditions are anonymized so that neither race, nor ethnicity, nor social networks are the issue, the main variable left is one of quality. Personally, I would imagine that there's actually a pipeline issue, but I don't have evidence to support that view. Anyway, so what does Tomasini suggest? He thinks that orchestras, quote, "should embrace diversity as a social virtue and advance other values along with academic achievement. For orchestras, the qualities of an ideal player might well include the talent as an educator, interest in unusual repertoire, or willingness to program innovative chamber events as well as pure musicianship," end quote. Which then leads to the thought, do these variables help improve the quality of an orchestra? Would people prefer to listen to such an orchestra that has these qualities? I don't know the answer to either of these questions, as I don't know almost anything about orchestras and I usually don't see them. Now, an assumption being made is that blacks and Latinos would have these qualities disproportionately to whites. Otherwise, what would be the point of suggesting them? But that wasn't made clear at all in the piece. There's no evidence to support that contention at all. So even with these reforms, there may still be low numbers of blacks and Latinos in orchestras. And I think that then leads to the question of whether it matters. But before I briefly touch on that, a qualifier and a summary of whether anonymous hiring works. I first want to highlight the various findings I have examined indicate we should be wary of generalizing. If something works in domain X, it may not work in domain Y, whether that domain is another company, or another country, or even within a country. A key factor is whether there is a lot of discrimination in the hiring process under investigation in the first place. Now clearly, there are numerous places on Earth that are staggeringly discriminatory, but it seems a lot of the research that people care about at this particular time are about countries that tend to be in the OECD, which probably has less compared to many other countries. Now, with that qualifier out of the way, when we're discussing whether anonymous hiring works, the first thing I would do is ask, what do you mean by work? How Darren of me. If the goal of anonymous hiring is to reduce potential or perceived bias in the hiring of employees so that people are more equally judged on their skills and experience, then yes, it seems to work. This is advantageous for various minority groups in the resume screening stage, as I mentioned above. But we also have to acknowledge that the study of economists and the Australian Civil Service indicated that fewer women and minorities were hired. The Australian experiment indicated that people were discriminating in favor of women and minorities, and anonymization negated that. As for the Canadian anonymized pilot, there was no bias discovered against minorities in the hiring process. While perhaps uncomfortable to some, I think all of this data is very important because it forces us to have an honest discussion about what we mean and what we are trying to achieve. If the goal is not actually about reducing bias to level the playing field, but instead to increase diversity among those who are hired, then we should just be clear about that. And of course, it could be both. If you anonymize, then employment equity or affirmative action programs cannot function. Now, Tomasini clearly thinks orchestras should better reflect their communities. But is this true? Well, I don't go to orchestras, and I'm the privileged white guy here, so I don't really know. Do sports fans feel that particular sports or sports teams would be better to watch if their racial diversity matched the population? I'm not a big sports guy either, but if that was indeed the case, we could think, how would this work? Should it be national or local? Would the NBA start shuffling around white and black players so that each team's race percentages more closely approximates the national average? This sounds ludicrous, and I'm really not trying to strawman, but I am trying to highlight that people who are advocating certain outcomes need to be pressed on exactly what their ideal outcome is. I think meritocracy is a great idea, but exceptionally hard to implement because of current or historical injustices and discrimination. People talk about equality of opportunity, but often the deck is stacked against certain people, so they don't get a chance to even have that equal opportunity in the first place. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but we have to be specific. If you want to solve a problem, you have to know what the problem is. Is it at the hiring stage, the resume screening stage, the pipeline stage, which could be higher education, or perhaps different cultural associations to types of work or interests? Or all of these things, or some more than others. All of this would have to be investigated for each different area of work. 2 final thoughts. 1, any organization thinking about implementing anonymous hiring should be mindful of the possible effects this will have and whether they go against other goals of the organization. And 2nd, discrimination exists, and it shouldn't. But assuming any difference among groups is an automatic indicator of discrimination may not be the best default hypothesis. It is better to have discrimination as one of several hypotheses while discussing or examining an issue. Until next time, think better to act better.
All right, Cristina, people are likely consuming more drinks in plastic bottles for the reasons that Adam laid out in his segment last week about aluminum cans and coins. So tell me, what happens to those empty plastic bottles after we put them in our recycle bin?
I have asked myself that question many times. What really happens to plastic drink bottles you toss in your recycling bin? And that is literally the title of a 2020 CBC News article by science and tech writer Emily Chung, also an occasional producer for Quirks and Quarks. Adam has covered plastic straws and plastic bags versus reusable bags, but we've never really dug deep into plastic bottles. If there's anything I've learned from being on the reality check, the answer to that question is probably complicated. It feels good to recycle, right? It feels like you're doing something when you throw that plastic bottle in the blue bin, and something feels better than nothing, right?
Absolutely.
However, as Chung bluntly puts it, the infinite triangular loop of arrows comforts us with the idea each one will be recycled over and over, but unfortunately, most of the time, that's a lie.
The infinite triangular loops of arrows is pretty good.
It's for beautiful writing. The grim truth is that many bottles aren't recycled at all. The ones that do usually don't get turned into other bottles, let alone recycled again. And instead, many end up in worldwide landfills or sadly the ocean. In fact, plastic bottles are among the top 3 items collected in shoreline cleanups. Now, a couple of stats from the article, Canada's Plastic Problem, Sorting Fact from Fiction, on oceana.ca. Oceana is the largest international organization focused solely on ocean conservation. Canadians produce a lot of plastic waste, an estimated 3.3 million tons per year. About 2.8 million tons of plastic waste ends up in Canadian landfills every year, equivalent to the weight of 24 CN towers.
Wow.
Now, many countries in Asia have become the world's dumping ground for plastic waste, and about 12% of Canada's plastic waste is sent outside of North America to be recycled, and that word is in quotes. Okay, so let's go through some of Chung's main questions. How recyclable are plastic bottles and how much is collected for recycling? Water and plastic pop bottles are made from a plastic called polyethylene terephthalate, or PET, which you've probably heard of. A general-purpose thermoplastic polymer known as number 1 plastic. It is technically one of the most recyclable plastics currently in use and doesn't degrade the way many do when recycled. Chung quotes Michael Shedler, a longtime industry plastic recycling consultant, who says, PET is the one plastic you can recycle over and over again. In Canada, thanks to Blue Bin initiatives, a 2017 study showed a 79% recovery rate for bottles or jars made from PET. Okay, well, that sounds pretty good to me. But PET isn't just used in bottles or jars. It's used in food containers known as thermoforms, which have a recovery rate of only 11%. Those are the kind of containers that you get if you're doing takeout, for instance. And Canada only represents a fraction of plastic bottles sold in North America. In the US, only 29% of plastic bottles were recycled in 2017.
Wow.
By the way, if you assumed all plastic collected gets recycled, CBC Marketplace did an eye-opening video expose last year tracking our plastic waste going undercover in Malaysia as plastic brokers. I linked to that episode in TRC's show notes. Eye-opening is kind of an understatement, to be honest, but bottom line, not all plastic gets recycled, especially waste from businesses or institutions. How does PET get recycled and what happens to it? Now, typically the plastic bottles we throw in our blue bin get sent to materials recovery facilities. They're sorted from other recyclables and packaged into bales. According to Chung, bales of recovered PET are typically purchased by 5 Canadian reclamation plants that wash them, grind them up, and sell the recycled PET. Now, Michael Shedler, who I mentioned earlier, told Chung, quote, "Fiber has always been the largest application for recycled PET. In Fact Checkers in 2015, Shedler's study for the Continuous Improvement Fund reported around 45% of our nation's recycled PET was sold as fiber to our neighbors to the south, which was used in consumer products like carpets, futons, and pillows. 30% of the recycled PET did end up being used in bottles, 12% in thermoforms, and 12% fell under other, which includes things like plastic film or, those plastic straps that hold bundles together. Why is most of our recycled PET turned into fiber instead of bottles? It's a good question. As Chung explains, the PET used specifically in bottles needs to be clear, colorless, and free of contaminants from things like labels. According to Joan Archer, a former beverage industry exec, quote, "Bottle-to-bottle recycling uses more energy and financial resources to sufficiently clean material to meet quality and safety specifications than is required by carpet and fiber applications." Now, this has been a big reason why the industry claps back when they're criticized for not using more recycled PET. And Shedler does note that a plastic water bottle's lifespan is much shorter than a pillow or a carpet, which is a very atom observation, I'd say. For the sake of time, let's cut to the chase. Is it even worth recycling PET into bottles? Shedler's 2015 study reported only 19% of recycled PET was used in bottles, with worldwide averages at 12%. And there doesn't seem to be much incentive when you hear that, quote, "virgin PET," made directly from raw materials derived from fossil fuels, is cheaper and easier to source than recycled PET. He also mentions the challenge posed by recycled PET being sourced from several places, since beverage companies prefer to sign long-term contracts for plastics. Ontario-based Ice River Springs Water Company claims they make bottles from 100% recycled PET and purchase over 80% of the collected PET in Ontario's blue bins. Their sustainability manager, Crystal Howe, or at least at the time of this writing, claims their bottle-to-bottle recycling reduces energy use by 70% and water consumption during manufacturing by 99%. She does admit, quote, "It doesn't make it cheaper, but it makes it better. Anytime you can recycle a bottle back, you are gaining another life for that plastic." Now, Shedler thinks the beverage industry should actually be held accountable for the waste that they create. And some big companies like Coca-Cola and others, they've stepped up and announced commitments to use higher recycled content. To end on an optimistic note, Chung lists some tangible things we could do to encourage more PET plastic recycling. This includes deposit return laws and minimum recycled content laws. So, there you have it. Another reason to get your water from the tap if you can.
Well, as you say, it's always complicated, right?
Yes, it is.
And with that, I hope everyone out there is staying safe and healthy, and we will talk to you again soon.
Stay classy, not smart-assy, and stay safe. For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.